Hey guys, today I'm going to show you how to properly pack some tapered wheel bearings and adjust them. Today we're working on a 2007 Ford Ranger. This tapered wheel bearing procedure works on car trailers, your utility trailers, a lot of two-wheel drive vehicles, all the same procedure, providing you have the same style wheel bearings. This is a tapered wheel bearing. You can see how the rollers are on an angle here. So the first thing I want to show you is how to get it apart. Here you go here. So we have to remove the dust cap as step one. They make a special pair of pliers that go around the dust cap like this, and you can wiggle them off. Some people use a big pair of channel locks, which looks like has been done on this one in the past. A lot of times just a regular screwdriver and a couple of taps around the edge, and you can separate the cap off. Then you can just twist around and you can get the cap off. Now if your cap is totally damaged or bent, you can try and straighten it out. This cap needs to keep water out. So if it's mangled to the point where it won't seal anymore, go ahead and buy yourself a new one. They're not that expensive. If you can't find a new one, straighten it out the best you can, and when it goes back on, get it all nice and clean, and you can seal up any holes or gaps with a little bit of silicone if you need to. So once we get the cap off, we're going to have to remove the cotter pin. Just bend these tabs out of the way with a pair of side cutters like this. And then you can grab the round end of the cotter pin, and I just pry up a little bit like that, and then I slip the side cutters up to the edge of in this case, the brake rotor, and I'll just pry it up like so, and the cotter pin comes out. Then they have a cage on them, cotter pin cage. Just pull that off. The next thing we need to do is remove the adjusting nut. Just use a pair of pliers like I've got here and just loosen it off. If it's too snug, you grab a wrench, crescent wrench, whatever you need to do, undo the nut. If you're working on a trailer, you won't have a whole rotor, but you'll just have the little hub assembly here. And you can give it a little jiggle at that point, and the bearing itself will come out. On the end of the bearing, on the outer bearing, it has a washer right here. So we're going to take those off, and we're going to set them down on a clean rag. Now here's a trick that works a large percentage of the time. Some trailers it won't work because the nut's too big, but if you have a smaller nut like this one, I put the nut back on. This is the pro trick of the day. I put the nut back on like that, and then I'll grab the hub assembly or the rotor, and I'm going to pull the rotor off. Now, as I'm pulling it off, I'm actually going to pull it down slightly on an angle. What this is going to do is it's going to actually remove the back bearing and the grease seal all in one go. So now the seal and the inner bearing is left on the spindle. I can take the nut off now. Also on the clean rag, I'm going to take the seal and the bearing on the clean rag. And now we're left with the spindle assembly. So you're going to clean your grease off of it. Now, in this spindle, this surface area right here is where the new seal is going to ride. Just like the old seal we took off here. So this is your old seal. And when it's pressed onto the rotor, it'll ride right here and spin like this. So when you get your new seal, make sure you got the right seal. By the inner diameter of this, should be a snug fit on here. What you want to do is you want to make sure that this sealing area here is smooth, similar to what it is here. So if you have to, use some emery cloth, sand it down. Get it nice and clean. Use some degreaser on there with some sandpaper. Get it clean. And then once your spindle's dressed, ready to go. So I got my wheel bearing grease. I'm just going to put a little bit around the spindle like this. All the way around. And I'm also going to put a little bit on here. Now, I'm not actually putting this side back together because I haven't cleaned the sealing surface properly. I'll show you what we're doing on the other side, which is all cleaned up, ready to go. So that's your spindle prep. Now we're going to get to the bearing portion of it, where we're going to pack some wheel bearings properly. So what we want to do before we pack our wheel bearings is we want to clean them. So you could get a little bucket. If you have a solvent tank, you can put them in the solvent tank with a stiff bristle brush. You can use a paintbrush, you can use a toothbrush, you can use some brake clean, you can use some paint thinner if you need to. You're going to get all the grease out of the rollers so they're nice and clean. What you don't want to do is you don't want to blow your rollers off with a blowgun. And what I mean by that is it's okay to blow the bearing out this way with a blowgun if you have it, but don't ever spin your bearing like this. You'll see some people that are spin the bearing super fast. It's just like a gun if these rollers come out of here, so don't do that. Just hold on to the bearing and blow it around this way if you have a blowgun accessible. If not, you can use some brake clean. But as long as you get it clean with a paintbrush or your toothbrush or some paint thinner and it's all dry in there, the next step is to inspect it. So what you want to do is you want to take a look at these rollers and look for any rough surfaces. So you can spin them around like this. Each roller will rotate as you spin it. And what you're looking for is rough surface on the rollers. If you find a rough surface on the roller, the bearing's no good and you have to change the bearing. And you have to change the bearing cup, which is in this case inside the rotor, or it'll be inside the hub if you have a trailer. So we don't see any bad rollers on here. Sometimes you'll see a little line on them, that's okay, but you don't want to feel anything rough with your thumbnail. A trick to see the inside, to see if the inside race is still in good shape, is to actually hold the inner race with your hand, squeeze the outer rollers and rotate it. And as you rotate it, if it's no good, you'll feel a rough spot. These ones are in good shape. So I've cleaned them all up, ready to go. So now we're going to pack them. To pack the wheel bearings, you can either buy a bearing packer. They make all kinds. This is a fancy one that you're going to press. I'm just going to inject the bearing with grease. So I just put my wheel bearing in there. We got a little pressing tool on the top, and as I push down, you'll see the grease coming out in between every single roller. As you can see, it injected the grease right up through all the rollers there. Now that's one method if you have the correct tool. If you don't have the correct tool and you're doing it manually, what you need to do is get some grease. Now you want to make sure your grease doesn't have any grit or junk in it. Get a little bit of wheel bearing grease like this. Put it in the palm of your hand. Then you grab your wheel bearing and you want to pack your wheel bearing with grease. So you don't want to be jamming it like this. You'll see a lot of people just going like this. That's not going to do it properly. And you're going to have a bearing failure. You want to go from the back side of the bearing right here. And you want to press down on your grease. And you keep working it. Pushing it down, pushing it down, pushing it down, and you work your way around, and you can see it's pushing the grease up through the rollers, just like my special tool does. And take your time here. Go over a bunch of times. If you're doing this and you see a bunch of black grease coming out of here, that means you didn't clean it good enough. You can keep going and keep going. You can inject as much grease as you need to, but you want to fill all these rollers all the way around like that. Once you get your bearing packed properly, like this one is here, I'll put a little bit of grease around the outside like this. Now this one's ready to install. Okay, so we've packed our wheel bearing with grease. We've coated the outside. Now what we want to do is we want to put some grease in your hub right here. But before you do that, maybe you have new hubs or new brake rotors that you're dealing with. You want to make sure that this is super clean. You can get some generic hubs and offshore style hubs, and in here will actually be rough cast. There'll actually be sand inside of there. So you gotta, if you have it rough or dirty inside of here, make sure you clean it up. Same procedure. You can use a paintbrush or a toothbrush, some solvent, some brake clean, get it clean, get it dry. Make sure there's no grit or grime in there. You go ahead and grab yourself a fingerful of grease and you stick it in below the cone area. And it's okay to use a fair amount. Grease is cheap. Do both sides. There's a cavity in there. I like to fill the cavity up. Not all the way, but a good amount. A couple fingerfuls. Like that. Got it in there. I've actually put a little more grease up on the inner race here, so it's sort of stacked up on there. So when I go ahead to put the bearing in there, it's going to sit in a pile of grease. Just like so. Now I'm going to go ahead and just wipe that surface. Like that. Nice and clean. It's a good idea to have some gloves on. So now this part right here is where the new seal's going to go. So I take a clean rag and I just wipe off that area like that. Now we got to take a look at the seal. There's a couple different types of seals. I think they sometimes use the term lip seal. This is the seal I have for this one. This style of seal is just basically the inside part is all rubber. Pretty heavy, thick rubber. Now you could have this style. This style has a garter spring on the inside. I don't know if you can see that. There's a little spring on the inside. This spring holds tension on this lip, which holds it against that sealing surface on the spindle. So a trick, sometimes what happens is when you're installing these things, you poke it and the garter spring comes off and you lose the tension and then the seal fails and then your bearings fail and nothing works out. So a trick you can do to prevent this garter spring from coming off, if you have that style, is you can get some wheel bearing grease and pack it in there. Like that, all the way around. I like to use caliper slide grease. It's a little heavier than wheel bearing grease and it really holds it in nice and tight. Now we're going to install the seal. Now you can go ahead and get yourself a nice flat piece of wood, as long as it's clean, and you can use that as a driver. They actually make driver tools, something like this. We can use that to drive our seal in, which is probably the best way to go. I got my bearing in there now and I'm ready to install the seal. I can use my seal driver. Or I can, if I have a metal seal, and if I'm careful not to distort the metal portion of it, I can just tap these in. This one. So now I've got the seal in here. It's fully seated on the backside. If I had this style that didn't have a flange on it, I would just go until the top part of the seal is flush and tap it in with a seal driver or a hammer like I did gently. You have to be careful with a hammer. I've done hundreds and hundreds of these. You can damage this, bend this, or break it. So if you're not super confident, find yourself a piece of nice flat wood or a socket that fits it perfectly or whatever you got to tap it in. So now that we've got it all installed into our hub assembly, or in this case our brake rotor, we're going to go ahead and put it in the vehicle. As you can see, this spindle's all cleaned up. I actually sanded up in here to make sure there's no excessive rust and the sealing surface is nice and clean. We're going to install that grease around the spindle. And I'm going to put a little bit on the seal surface as well. Now you don't want to go too crazy with the grease because it can come out and get into your brakes and things like that, but that's about the perfect amount there. Okay, so now we're going to slip the hub assembly on, or your brake rotor or whatever you're working on. What we want to do is we want to put it over the spindle and seat it all the way in. As we're going in, we don't want to drag this seal across the sharp threads on the end of the spindle. It can damage the seal and cause it to fail. So I got it here and in. You can feel it. You can feel it when it goes in. If you're having some trouble, maybe your new bearings are not the same size as the spindle, so you should check that if you're having some troubles. Put your outer bearing in. I've also got grease packed in there. I'm pulling out the excess of grease around the edge. As I push the bearing in, it squished a bit out. I'm going to put my clean washer back on. This is the same with your trailer bearings. Put your washer back on and now your nut. So you can go ahead and grab yourself a wrench, or you can grab yourself a pair of those slip joint pliers, and we're just going to snug this nut up here. We're not too worried right now about adjusting anything. We just want to snug the nut up. And as we snug it, we're going to rotate our hub assembly or our brake rotor. Snug it some more, rotate it some more, snug. And what we're doing here is we're just ensuring that the bearing is seated on the spindle and everything's sitting in place properly where you want it to be. Okay, so we've done that and we've rotated it. There's no strange noises, nothing grinding. This is quite tight right now. This is way too tight for a wheel bearing. If it was this tight, it would actually burn your bearings up pretty quickly. So now that we've snugged this up and we've rotated our hub assembly and everything feels good, we want to back this nut off. We want to back it off so you can turn it with your fingers. Now what you do is you bring the nut up tight, but not tight. Basically, you just turn the nut, and what you're looking for, as this comes loose, you can actually feel the hub rocking back and forth. If you pull on it like this, you can hear that. And what you want to do is you want to adjust the nut until that play goes away. It's basically just a little bit more than finger tight. Very loose. I could probably almost get it off with my fingers if I wanted to. That's how loose it is. I have no play in the hub assembly. I have no play in the rotor. Now I'm going to put my cage on. The cage can be rotated until the cotter pin holes line up. Get yourself a new cotter pin. Don't bother using the old one. You can get a long cotter pin, short cotter pin, it doesn't matter. Slip your cotter pin in. You can see that there's a long and a short leg on this one. I like to put the long leg out. So I drop my cotter pin in with the long leg out. There it is there. I grab the long leg with my side cutters and I just pull it straight back. Then I go up from the bottom, just holding onto it with my side cutters, and I push it straight up. Like that. Now, if this is too long, I would cut it off. If this one's the right length, I'm just going to tap it over like that a little bit. The reason I want to tap it over, because if I leave this too long, it'll actually rub on the dust cap, cutting a hole in it. Now, you can either rotate this bottom leftover part of the cotter pin up, like that, or you can just snip it off. So I like to pull them up like that and then just take the excess off like that, watching your eyes that the end of the cotter pin doesn't go flying in your eye. Now we got the dust cap. And this is exactly what I said. It's just to keep the dust out or the water out. So a trick I learned in trade school a long time ago was to put a thin layer of grease inside your dust cap like this. And the reason for this is if any dust or junk does get in there, it has a chance to stick to the cap rather than going into your bearings. So you can go ahead and tap it on. Sometimes they'll dent. This one is actually a bit loose, so I might I should have a new one, but I can bend this out a little bit here. Put a little more bite on the cap. And tap it in with a screwdriver. Now I've got the dust cap on. I rotate it. There's no cotter pin or rubbing noises on there. This is ready to go. The only thing else I would want to do in this case is clean this little greasy cap off and check to make sure there's no holes. If there is, I could put a little bit of silicone all the way around there to help hold this moisture out. And that's it. That's how you adjust and clean a tapered wheel bearing on a trailer or two-wheel drive vehicle or anything that has the exact same setup. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.